Every raise feels like permission. Permission to upgrade the car, the apartment, the vacations, the version of yourself people see at dinner parties. Most people take that permission the moment it's offered. A rare few refuse it for 30 years straight. And that refusal is the entire story of how they end up wealthy while everyone around them ends up merely comfortable looking. Most people wanted financial freedom, but they wanted a better lifestyle first. They told themselves the upgrade was temporary, a one-time reward for hard work, and then the next raise arrived, and the next upgrade felt just as deserved. Income kept rising, net worth never moved. Nobody noticed because on paper, everything looked like success. Here is the thesis this story is built on. He didn't get rich by earning more. He got rich by refusing to spend more. In a mid-sized town outside Columbus, Ohio, a man named Victor started his career as a junior accountant at a regional insurance firm, earning a salary that placed him firmly in the middle of everyone he knew. He rented a small one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, drove a used sedan with over 100,000 miles already on it, and ate most of his meals at home, not out of necessity, but out of a habit he'd built early and never questioned. For the first 3 years, nobody thought twice about Victor's modest life. That's simply what a junior employee's life looked like. But as his salary climbed with promotions, first to senior accountant, then to a management role, something unusual happened. Nothing changed. He stayed in the same apartment 2 years past the point most colleagues assumed he'd move. He kept the same sedan through 2 rounds of coworkers leasing new vehicles to match their new titles. He still packed lunch in a plain container while his peers ate out most days, expensing meals, or simply spending freely now that their paychecks had grown. Colleagues started to talk, not maliciously, but with the particular kind of concern people reserve for someone who seems to be underperforming their own success. "You could afford better than this," one coworker told him at a company happy hour, gesturing vaguely at Victor's worn watch and modest shoes. Victor just shrugged. "I can afford exactly what I have. That's the part that matters." What none of them saw was the account sitting quietly behind his modest life, a brokerage account he'd opened his very first month of employment, into which a fixed percentage of every paycheck disappeared before he ever saw it, automatically, without exception, regardless of raises, bonuses, or promotions. While his income tripled over the following decade, his lifestyle stayed almost perfectly flat. The gap between the two, growing wider every year, was quietly doing something none of his coworkers' lifestyles ever could. By his mid-30s, Victor had settled into a financial rhythm that felt to him almost unremarkable. But from the outside, to anyone who bothered to actually look closely, it was strange in a way that was hard to name. Every promotion came with a predictable pattern, a modest celebration, a night out with the team, and then the following Monday, the exact same apartment, the exact same commute, the exact same grocery list. His salary had roughly tripled since his first year. His monthly expenses had barely moved at all. He wasn't cheap in the way people sometimes assumed. He didn't clip coupons obsessively or deny himself every small comfort. He simply refused to let his spending rise automatically with his income, treating every raise as an opportunity to widen the gap between what he earned and what he needed, rather than an invitation to close it. The difference went, without fail, into the same low-cost index funds he'd chosen his first year on the job, unglamorous, diversified, and left almost entirely alone. His coworkers, meanwhile, upgraded in step with their titles. New cars arrived with new job levels. Apartments got bigger. Vacations got more frequent and more photographed. On the surface, they looked like the successful ones. The promotions came with proof, and the proof was parked in the office lot every morning. Victor's proof was invisible. sitting in an account statement nobody but him and his broker ever saw. The gap became impossible to ignore during a company-wide restructuring in his early 40s, when a division-wide layoff hit senior staff without much warning. Several colleagues who'd out-earned Victor for years suddenly found themselves without income and, more alarmingly, without much of a cushion. Car payments, mortgage payments scaled to double income assumptions, credit card balances that had crept up during years of lifestyle creep. Victor was let go in the same round. He didn't panic. He didn't need to. He had, without ever describing it this way, built himself an exit that didn't depend on that specific paycheck. His expenses were low enough and his investments substantial enough that the job loss registered as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. He took 4 months before accepting new work, something none of his former colleagues could afford to do, and used the time deliberately, reassessing, learning a new certification, ultimately landing a role that paid even better than the one he'd lost. It was the first moment several old coworkers began to suspect that Victor's plain life wasn't a limitation, it might have been a decision. The clearest proof of what Victor had actually built came almost a decade later at a reunion dinner for former colleagues from the insurance firm, most of whom had scattered to new companies, new cities, new versions of the same lifestyle-driven climb. Conversation drifted, as it usually does at these things, toward houses, renovations, the cost of private school tuition, the stress of carrying 2 car payments on one income after a divorce. Victor mostly listened. Someone eventually turned to him. "So what have you been up to all these years, Victor? Still driving that same old sedan?"
He laughed. "Different sedan, same idea." The table pressed, half joking, half genuinely curious, the way people do when they sense there's a story being underplayed. Victor didn't offer numbers, that had never been his habit, but he did offer the one detail that mattered. "I've maxed out retirement contributions every year since my first job. Never missed one even during the layoff. Everything else just kind of built itself after that." Silence isn't usually a dramatic thing at a dinner table, but this one lingered a beat too long. A former colleague, now driving a leased luxury SUV and financing a home renovation he'd mentioned twice already that evening, asked the question everyone else was thinking but hadn't said. "Wait, are you actually comfortable? Like really comfortable?"
Victor considered the word for a moment. "I stopped needing to look comfortable a long time ago," he said. "That's usually when you actually become it." He didn't elaborate further, and nobody pushed, but the moment reframed for at least a few people at that table everything they thought they'd understood about Victor over the years. The plain apartment, the modest watch, the lunch packed in a container while everyone else expensed their meals. It hadn't been a lack of ambition. It had been a different definition of what ambition was supposed to buy. What none of them knew, and what Victor never volunteered, was that the account he'd opened his very first month of employment, funded automatically, ignored deliberately, left alone through market crashes, layoffs, and every promotion in between, had, by that point, crossed a threshold most of the people at that table were still decades away from reaching, despite earning salaries that had long since surpassed his own. Victor never corrected anyone's assumptions about him, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because he'd learned early that the moment people know your numbers, they stop seeing you and start seeing the number instead. He preferred being underestimated. It came with a kind of freedom that visible wealth never offered. Nobody asked him for loans. Nobody expected him to pick up every check. Nobody's opinion of him rose or fell with a balance he never showed. Years later, a younger analyst at his new company approached him after noticing the same pattern everyone eventually noticed: the modest car, the packed lunch, the total absence of any visible reward for a title that had grown substantially over the years. "Can I ask you something?" the younger man said. "You've been promoted like 4 times since I started here. Why does nothing about your life look different?" Victor thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because the version of me that upgrades everything the moment it's affordable never actually gets ahead," he said. "He just gets comfortable at a slightly higher altitude with the same distance left to fall. I wasn't trying to look like I'd made it. I was trying to actually make it. And those two things usually cost each other." That's the part of Victor's story that matters more than any number on a brokerage statement. Getting rich, for most people who actually manage it, has very little to do with how much they earn, and almost everything to do with the gap they're willing to protect between what they earn and what they spend. A gap that widens every time a raise arrives and nothing about the lifestyle moves to meet it. Wealth built this way doesn't look impressive while it's happening. It looks like the same car for another year, the same apartment past the point of necessity, a lunch packed instead of bought. It looks, to almost everyone watching, like someone who simply isn't earning as much as they actually are, because the entire strategy depends on nobody being able to tell the difference from the outside. If your own income has grown over the years without your net worth growing anywhere near as fast, this is the lesson worth sitting with. The upgrade will always feel earned, it will always feel deserved, and it will always be available to defer for one more year, one more raise, one more decision to let the gap widen instead of close. You don't need to earn more to build wealth. You need to stop letting more arrive and immediately leave. If this story changed how you think about raises, lifestyle, and what wealth actually looks like, subscribe to the channel for more true stories of quiet financial discipline, and comment "No upgrade" if you're ready to protect your gap, starting with your next paycheck.